They say everyone has a limit, a moment when restraint crumbles, when the lines between right and wrong blur, and a quiet life erupts into chaos. For Maggie Stanton, a 62-year-old retired florist, that moment had come. She wasn't here to nurture life with delicate blooms or offer comfort through bouquets. No, she was here for something far darker. The parking lot of a Las Vegas casino was alive with flashing lights and muffled laughter. But Maggie wasn't here for the games or the glitter. She stood still, clutching a crumpled paper in one hand, a name, an address, and years of betrayal folded into that single scrap. Her other hand trembled slightly, brushing against the outline of something she never imagined herself carrying. A cold, metallic reminder of the lengths she'd been pushed to. Across the lot, he emerged. Victor Lane, the man who had stripped her of everything she'd built in her life. He didn't notice her, too busy laughing, his arm draped casually over a woman half his age. He moved without care, as though his sins were buried too deep to ever surface. But Maggie was here to prove him wrong. What happens when someone who's been wronged decides to take justice into their own hands? This isn't a story of heroes or villains. This is a story of loss, betrayal, and a choice that changed everything. If you believe scammers deserve to be tracked down and punished, hit that subscribe button now. Maggie Stanton had always found peace among flowers. For decades, she worked as a florist in a small, unassuming town in Illinois. Her days were spent arranging vibrant bouquets for weddings, solemn wreaths for funerals, and everything in between. Each petal she touched seemed to tell a story of love, loss, celebration, or grief. She had become the quiet observer of life's cycles, crafting beauty from the fleeting nature of flowers. Her shop, Petal and Grace, wasn't just a business, it was her sanctuary. Located on the corner of a sleepy street, it was where Maggie poured her heart into her work. Customers adored her for her calm demeanor and her knack for creating arrangements that felt deeply personal. Over the years, her hands became a map of her life. Calloused from pruning thorns, but gentle from handling delicate blooms. Maggie wasn't wealthy by any stretch, but she had built a modest and stable life. As a single mother, she raised her son Daniel with love and determination. Her days were long, often starting before dawn at the flower market and ending late at night as she prepped orders for the next day. Every penny she earned went toward providing Daniel with a better life. She made sacrifices, missing PTA meetings, skipping vacations, and setting aside her own dreams to ensure he never went without. By the time Daniel graduated college and started his career in California, Maggie was nearing retirement. Her shop had become quieter as chain stores and online flower deliveries took over. She decided to close Petal and Grace, not out of failure, but because she felt it was time. At 62, she was ready to step away from the hustle and finally enjoy the fruits of her labor. Retirement brought a mix of emotions. At first, Maggie embraced the slower pace, spending her mornings sipping tea on her porch, watching birds flit between the gardenias she had planted years ago. Her modest savings gave her the freedom to explore small joys, weekend drives to local farmers markets, afternoons volunteering at a community garden, and quiet evenings with her favorite novels. But as the months passed, an ache began to settle in, a loneliness that was hard to ignore. Daniel called often, but he was busy with his life on the West Coast. The friends Maggie had made through the shop drifted away, caught up in their own families and routines. Her days, once so full of purpose, now stretched into empty hours. One evening, as she watered her prized orchids, each one a testament to her patience and care, she realized how much she missed meaningful connection. The flowers were beautiful, but they couldn't talk back. It was her friend, Linda, who first suggested she join an online forum for gardening enthusiasts. Linda had found joy in connecting with others who shared her interests, and she believed it might help Maggie feel less isolated. Reluctantly, Maggie took Linda's advice. She spent hours scrolling through the forums, reading posts about soil mixes, pest control, and favorite flower varieties. At first, she only observed, too shy to engage. But one evening, a particular thread caught her eye. The Rare Orchid Collectors Group. It was filled with vibrant photos of orchids from all over the world and passionate discussions about cultivation techniques. And that's where she first encountered Victor Lane. He wasn't just another faceless username. His posts were thoughtful, his comments encouraging, and his photos stunning. There was one picture in particular, a pale lavender orchid, delicately framed by sunlight. Beneath it he had written, "This one reminds me of second chances, don't you think? Sometimes life surprises us with beauty when we least expect it." Maggie couldn't resist. She replied, mentioning her own struggles with cultivating orchids and how they'd become her solace after retirement. Victor responded almost immediately, his tone warm and understanding. He told her about his greenhouse, how orchids had helped him cope with the loss of his wife, and how he admired anyone with the patience to care for such fragile plants. Their conversations grew over the following weeks. They began messaging outside the forum, sharing details about their lives. Victor described himself as a retired botanist, a man who had dedicated his life to nurturing beauty in the world. He spoke of his dream to one day open a community greenhouse where anyone, regardless of their background, could experience the healing power of plants. Maggie was captivated. Victor wasn't just knowledgeable, he was kind, attentive, and genuinely seemed to value the things she held dear. For the first time in years, Maggie felt a spark, a connection that brought color back into her world. Her evenings were no longer spent in silence. Instead, she found herself eagerly awaiting Victor's next message, her phone lighting up with words that made her feel seen and appreciated. Little did Maggie know, that first reply to Victor Lane's post was the beginning of a path that would lead her far from the peaceful life she had built. It was the start of a journey filled with promises, betrayal, and a decision that would change everything. Victor Lane had mastered the art of appearances. To those who stumbled across his carefully crafted online profiles, he seemed like the kind of man people instinctively trusted. His photos painted the picture of a life rooted in simplicity and sincerity. A widowed botanist who had turned his grief into a life dedicated to nurturing beauty. One image showed him in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up as he gently tended to a vibrant orchid in his greenhouse. Another captured him with a shaggy golden retriever, his late wife's dog, as he explained in his captions. And then there were the community group photos, Victor at a garden workshop, smiling warmly as he helped a young child plant seeds in a pot. His captions were always thoughtful, laced with a touch of poetic wisdom. A flower's journey reminds us that even the smallest roots can grow into something remarkable. It was hard not to be charmed. Victor Lane seemed to be the kind of man who had weathered life's storms with grace and found solace in helping others. His profile told a story of resilience, compassion, and a love for the natural world. But none of it was real. Behind the warm photos and poignant words was a man living a life as far from humble as one could imagine. The real Victor Lane, if that was even his name, was a career scammer. His greenhouse business, frequently mentioned in his conversations with targets, didn't exist. It was a convenient fiction, a narrative he wove to establish trust and paint himself as a hard-working, grounded man. In truth, Victor's world was built on deception. He had no greenhouse, no late wife, and no golden retriever. His life revolved around high-end casinos, luxury hotels, and exclusive clubs where no one cared to ask too many questions about how he made his money. Victor had been perfecting his craft for over a decade. He wasn't just a scammer. He was a predator, and his targets were carefully chosen. Victor didn't go after anyone. He sought out a very specific kind of person, retirees who were financially stable but emotionally vulnerable. Women who had spent their lives putting others first, often at the expense of their own happiness. He knew how to spot them. Their social media posts, even when subtle, often hinted at loneliness, a shared memory of a lost spouse, a photo of an empty garden bench, or a comment about missing family gatherings. These small clues were enough for Victor to build his approach. When Victor found someone who fit the profile, he didn't rush in. He took his time, studying their likes, dislikes, and personal histories. His introductions were always casual, his tone warm but never overbearing. He wanted to come across as someone safe, someone who understood them in a way few others could. Victor had a catalog of personas he could slip into, each one tailored to a different kind of victim. For Maggie, he chose to be a widower, a man who had loved deeply and lost profoundly. He spoke of his late wife, weaving intricate stories about their life together, their shared love for orchids, and how he had struggled to find purpose after her passing. It wasn't just his words that sold the lie. Victor's entire online presence supported his narrative. His photos were staged with precision, from the soft lighting in his supposed greenhouse to candid shots of him holding a steaming cup of coffee beside a blooming flower. Every detail was designed to evoke trust and admiration. But Victor's charm was more than just surface level. He had an uncanny ability to read people, to pick up on their insecurities and desires with astonishing accuracy. He didn't just make his victims feel understood, he made them believe he was the answer to their unspoken prayers. Victor's scams were methodical. He rarely asked for money right away. Instead, he built a connection, slowly gaining his victims' trust. His approach was patient, like a gardener nurturing a seed, and when the time was right, he would strike, always with a carefully constructed reason that seemed plausible, even urgent. He would mention a shipment delay at his greenhouse, a sudden financial setback, or a legal issue that needed immediate attention. The amounts he requested were small at first, just enough to seem harmless. But as the relationship deepened, so did the financial demands. What set Victor apart from others in his line of work was his ability to maintain his lies. Even when his victims started to question him, he had answers ready, layers of explanations that reinforced his persona. He knew how to deflect suspicion, how to make doubt feel like guilt. And when the well ran dry, when his victims had given all they could, Victor vanished without a trace. Profiles were deleted, phone numbers disconnected, and emails left unanswered. For him, it was just another chapter closed. But for his victims, it was the start of a nightmare. Victor Lane wasn't just a man living off stolen money. He was living off stolen dreams, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts and shattered lives. Each scam funded his lavish lifestyle, private parties in exotic locations, expensive suits tailored to perfection, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had outsmarted yet another trusting soul. To Victor, it wasn't personal. His victims were numbers on a spreadsheet, opportunities to exploit rather than people to respect. But what Victor didn't know was that one of his marks would be different. One of them wouldn't fade quietly into the background. For Maggie Stanton, this wasn't just about money. It was about something far more precious. And Victor Lane was about to learn what happens when you cross someone with nothing left to lose. Maggie Stanton didn't know how much she needed the connection until it was already forming. At first, her conversations with Victor Lane were casual, just friendly exchanges on the gardening forum. His responses always carried a sense of ease, as though he had all the time in the world to listen. It felt refreshing, a stark contrast to the hurried, surface-level conversations she'd grown used to. Victor reached out to her privately after seeing a photo Maggie had posted of her orchid collection. He complimented her meticulous care and mentioned how rare it was to find someone with such dedication. His words were genuine, or at least they felt that way, and Maggie, unused to such attention, couldn't help but smile. Their initial messages were simple. Victor talked about his greenhouse, describing it as his refuge from the chaos of the world. He painted vivid pictures of the space, a warm, glass-walled sanctuary filled with rows of orchids in every imaginable color. He shared little anecdotes like how a stray cat had wandered in one day and refused to leave, or how he had once overwatered a rare orchid and spent weeks nursing it back to health. Maggie found herself captivated by these stories. They were detailed, personal, and relatable. She could almost see the greenhouse, hear the faint hum of bees near the flowers, and feel the sunlight streaming through the glass. It was a life she could picture herself being a part of. A simple, peaceful existence surrounded by beauty. Victor seemed equally interested in Maggie's life. He asked thoughtful questions, not the shallow kind meant to pass the time, but ones that made her pause and reflect. He wanted to know how she first fell in love with flowers, what her proudest creation had been, and what she missed most about her shop. His curiosity felt genuine, and for Maggie, it was a relief to have someone who truly listened. Over time, their conversations deepened. Victor began opening up about his own life, or rather, the version of his life he had carefully constructed. He told Maggie about losing his wife to a sudden illness years ago, describing how the grief had nearly consumed him. He said it was his greenhouse that saved him, giving him a purpose and a way to honor her memory. His vulnerability struck a chord with Maggie. She saw in Victor someone who understood loss, someone who had walked a path similar to hers. She found herself sharing pieces of her own story, how she had raised her son alone, the sacrifices she had made, and the loneliness that had crept in after retirement. With every message, it felt as though they were building something meaningful, a connection rooted in mutual respect and shared understanding. One day, Victor surprised her with a small package. Inside was a tiny orchid seedling, carefully wrapped with a note. "This one reminded me of you. Delicate but resilient. I thought it might brighten your day." Maggie's heart swelled as she read the words. It had been years since anyone had gone out of their way to do something so thoughtful for her. The gifts didn't stop there. A week later, another package arrived, a handwritten letter accompanied by a pressed flower framed in glass. In the letter, Victor wrote about how he had spent the afternoon walking through a field of wildflowers, thinking about the joy Maggie must have brought to her customers with her arrangements. Maggie was overwhelmed. These gestures weren't grand, but they were deeply personal. They made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. Victor wasn't just another man trying to impress her. He seemed to genuinely value who she was and what she loved. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Victor asked Maggie to send him photos of her floral creations, and she eagerly obliged. She shared pictures of wedding bouquets she had made years ago, arrangements she had crafted for local events, and even a simple centerpiece she had put together for her own dining table. Victor's responses were effusive yet sincere. He praised her talent, calling her work artful and timeless. He mentioned how her arrangements reminded him of his late wife's favorite flowers, adding a layer of emotional intimacy to their exchanges. Maggie found herself looking forward to his messages, checking her phone more often than she cared to admit. Victor had a way of making Maggie feel special, as though she were the only person who truly understood him. His words carried weight, and his attention felt like a balm for the loneliness she had been carrying. She didn't notice how easily she was slipping into his narrative, how seamlessly he was weaving himself into her life. The connection felt natural, almost too good to be true. But for Maggie, it wasn't about logic or reason. It was about the warmth that Victor brought into her world, the sense of being appreciated and valued. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, and she wasn't ready to let it go. For Maggie Stanton, the months following her connection with Victor Lane were some of the happiest she'd experienced in years. Their conversations were no longer just exchanges. They were a lifeline. Victor made her feel like she wasn't just part of his life, but a central figure in his dreams. Yet, like the most delicate blooms, their connection would wither under the weight of what was to come. It began innocently enough. One evening, Victor messaged Maggie with an unusual sense of urgency. He described a storm that had swept through his town the previous night, wreaking havoc on his greenhouse. His words painted a vivid picture: shattered glass, flooded floors, and orchids damaged beyond repair. He sent photos that seemed to confirm the destruction: rows of limp, waterlogged plants and jagged shards of glass scattered across the soil. Victor's tone was apologetic, almost embarrassed, as he explained how the storm had set him back significantly. He told Maggie he had tried to cover the repairs himself, but quickly realized the damage was beyond what he could afford. His insurance claim, he said, was tied up in red tape, leaving him in a precarious position. At first, Maggie felt a pang of sympathy. She could imagine the heartbreak of seeing something you had worked so hard to build left in ruins. Then, Victor hesitated before making his request. He asked if Maggie could lend him $3,000 to help with the repairs, promising to pay her back as soon as his insurance cleared. Maggie hesitated. It wasn't a small amount, but she rationalized it. Victor wasn't just anyone. He was someone she had grown to trust, someone who had supported her emotionally in ways no one else had. And it wasn't just money. It was a way to help rebuild what they had talked about so often: the dream of a thriving greenhouse where they could both find peace. She wired the money the next morning. Victor was effusive in his gratitude, sending her a heartfelt message that made her feel like she had truly made a difference in his life. He even sent an update a few days later, claiming the repairs were underway and that her generosity had been a lifesaver. But that wasn't the end of it. A few weeks later, Victor messaged Maggie again, this time with a different issue. He explained that a supplier he depended on for rare orchids had suddenly raised their prices, jeopardizing his ability to restock his greenhouse. Without these supplies, he claimed, his business would struggle to recover. He asked for another loan, $5,000 this time, assuring her it was only temporary. Maggie hesitated longer this time, but Victor's persistence was persuasive. He framed it not as a favor, but as an investment in their shared future. He reminded her of their plans to one day combine their love for gardening into a larger project, a vision that had started to feel real to Maggie. She transferred the money, convinced she was helping him through a rough patch. But as the weeks turned into months, Victor's requests grew more frequent and more urgent. There was always a reason. A legal battle with his landlord over zoning issues required immediate funds for attorney fees. A surprise tax audit had frozen his accounts temporarily. An opportunity to buy rare orchid seeds at a discounted rate could save his business from the brink of collapse. Each time, Victor had a carefully crafted explanation, accompanied by just enough evidence to make his story believable. Photos, receipts, and even emails that appeared legitimate. Maggie found herself wiring money again and again, each transfer feeling less like a choice and more like a necessity. She wasn't just investing in Victor, she was investing in the life they had imagined together. A life that, in her heart, felt closer than ever. By now, Maggie's savings were dwindling. She began dipping into the retirement fund she had spent years building. But she justified it by telling herself it was temporary, that Victor would repay every penny once his business was back on its feet. After all, wasn't that what partnerships were about? Helping each other in times of need? But Victor's tone began to shift. His messages, once warm and attentive, grew shorter and less frequent. He was always busy, always tied up with something that demanded his immediate attention. Maggie started to feel uneasy, but every time she voiced her concerns, Victor would reassure her with the same charm that had drawn her in from the beginning. Then, one day, everything unraveled. Maggie woke up to find a message from Victor, but it wasn't like the ones before. This time, he said he was going offline for business reasons. He assured her it was temporary and that he'd be in touch soon. But the message lacked the warmth she had grown accustomed to, and it left her with an uneasy feeling. She tried calling him later that day, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She sent messages, but they remained unread. She logged on to the gardening forum where they had first met, only to find that Victor's profile had disappeared. Days turned into weeks, and the realization began to sink in. Victor Lane was gone. Maggie checked her bank statements, her heart sinking as she tallied the total. $120,000. It wasn't just her savings, it was her security, her future, and the dream she had clung to for months. All of it gone in an instant. She scoured every message, every detail of their conversations, searching for an explanation, a clue, or even a mistake that could undo what had happened. But there was nothing. The man she thought she knew so well had vanished, leaving behind nothing but empty promises and a gaping void where her trust had once been. For Maggie Stanton, the world she had built with Victor was nothing more than a lie. And for the first time in months, she found herself truly alone. Maggie felt humiliated. She replayed every conversation in her mind, searching for the moment she should have seen through his lies. How had she been so blind? So naive? She had always considered herself a cautious woman, someone who had spent her life protecting herself and her son from life's pitfalls. Yet here she was, a victim of a scam that seemed so obvious in hindsight. She avoided answering calls from friends, too ashamed to admit what had happened. How could she explain this? How could she face anyone knowing she had been deceived so completely? The isolation she had felt before Victor came into her life returned, this time with a crushing weight of guilt and regret. But Maggie wasn't the type to wallow for long. As the initial shock wore off, it was replaced by a burning need to take action. She needed answers. She needed to do something, anything, that might help her reclaim what she had lost. Her first step was to report the scam to the local police. Maggie arrived at the station early one morning, clutching a folder filled with printouts of emails, screenshots of messages, and even the receipts for the money she had sent Victor. She explained everything to the officer at the front desk, her voice trembling with a mix of desperation and determination. The officer listened patiently, but his response was disheartening. He explained that cases like this were notoriously difficult to solve. Scammers often operated under fake names, using untraceable accounts and offshore networks to cover their tracks. The odds of recovering her money, he said, were slim to none. Maggie felt the familiar sting of betrayal, this time from a system that seemed indifferent to her plight. The officer filed her report, but his tone made it clear that she shouldn't expect much to come of it. As she left the station, Maggie clutched her folder tightly, her heart sinking further. But if there was one thing Maggie Stanton knew how to do, it was persevere. She had spent her life overcoming obstacles, raising her son on her own, and building a life of stability and dignity. She wasn't about to let Victor Lane get away without a fight. Back home, Maggie sat down at her computer and opened the folder she had brought to the police. Inside was a trove of information. Messages filled with promises, photos of Victor's supposed greenhouse, and details about his fabricated life. She began reading through them, not as a heartbroken victim, but as a woman on a mission. Every detail mattered. Maggie scrutinized every word Victor had written, every photo he had sent. She noticed things she hadn't paid attention to before. The timestamps on his messages, the metadata embedded in his photos, even the subtle inconsistencies in his stories. One photo caught her attention, a picture of Victor standing in what he claimed was his greenhouse. Maggie had admired it when he first sent it, impressed by the neat rows of orchids and the soft glow of sunlight streaming through the glass. But now, she noticed something odd. A faint reflection in the glass behind him. It wasn't a greenhouse at all. It looked more like a modern office building. Another detail emerged from an email Victor had sent about his supplier issues. He mentioned a name, Frank, in passing, claiming it was the person causing delays. Maggie remembered thinking nothing of it at the time, but now it felt like a breadcrumb, a small piece of a larger puzzle. Her determination grew stronger with each discovery. She started cross-referencing Victor's messages with public records, searching for any connection, no matter how small. She joined online groups for victims of scams, sharing her story and learning from others who had faced similar betrayals. It was through one of these groups that Maggie found her first real lead. Another woman had been scammed by someone using a profile eerily similar to Victor's. The details of his story were almost identical, right down to the photos of the greenhouse and the dog. But this woman had something Maggie didn't. A partial email address that Victor had accidentally included in one of his messages. Maggie latched onto the lead like a lifeline. She searched for the email address online, tracing it to a social media account that had been inactive for years. But the account had one crucial piece of information. A photo of Victor at what appeared to be a high-end resort. The discovery was bittersweet. On one hand, it confirmed that Victor wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. On the other, it was a painful reminder of the life he was likely still living. A life funded by her savings and the dreams of countless other victims. Maggie's search consumed her days and nights. She pored over every scrap of information, every lead, refusing to let the trail go cold. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her sense of control, and her belief in justice. Victor Lane had taken everything from Maggie, but he had underestimated her resolve. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Maggie saved every scrap of information, determined to build a case that couldn't be ignored. That's when she decided to bring in professional help. Dion Carter was a private investigator known for his expertise in cybercrimes. Maggie found him through an online recommendation, and from their first conversation, she knew he was the right person for the job. Dion was meticulous, methodical, and deeply empathetic. He understood the emotional toll scams like these took on their victims and was determined to help Maggie find the answers she needed. Dion began by analyzing everything Maggie had collected: emails, photos, messages, and receipts. He explained how scammers often used multiple layers of deception, but even the most careful ones left digital breadcrumbs. One of his first breakthroughs came from an email Victor had sent about his supposed greenhouse. Dion traced the email header information, revealing an IP address linked not to a rural town, but to a high-end server located in Las Vegas. It was a small clue, but it confirmed Maggie's suspicions. Victor's carefully curated life was nothing more than a facade. From there, Dion focused on the photos Victor had shared. Using reverse image search tools, he discovered that many of the pictures weren't original. Several had been pulled from public sources, edited just enough to look unique. But there was one photo that stood out, a candid shot of Victor at what appeared to be a social event. The reflection in a glass panel behind him revealed a logo from a luxury resort in Las Vegas. This was the break they had been waiting for. Dion dug deeper, combing through social media accounts, public records, and even forums unrelated to gardening. Piece by piece, Victor's real life began to emerge. Victor Lane wasn't the widowed botanist he had claimed to be. He was a man living large in the shadows, hopping between luxury resorts and high-stakes poker tables. His name changed with every new victim, but his habits remained consistent. He flaunted his wealth in places where no one asked too many questions. Then came the final piece of evidence. Dion found a recent photo of Victor posted by an acquaintance on social media. It showed him sitting at a high-stakes poker table, his face partially obscured by a pair of designer sunglasses. The caption read, "Big wins tonight with the crew." The location tag, Las Vegas. Maggie stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity. There he was, the man who had stolen everything from her, laughing and thriving as if her life's work meant nothing. It was infuriating. But it was also motivating. With Dion's help, Maggie mapped out her next steps. She wasn't interested in simply filing another report or warning others online. She wanted to confront Victor Lane face to face, to make him see the pain he had caused. As Maggie booked her flight to Las Vegas, a sense of resolve washed over her. She didn't know exactly what she would say or do when she saw him, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let Victor Lane slip away this time. The sun had begun to set over Las Vegas, casting a golden glow on the glittering cityscape. Maggie Stanton stepped off the cab at the entrance of the Grand Casino, clutching her small purse tightly. She wasn't here for the bright lights or the thrill of a gamble. No. Maggie was here for something far more personal, far more dangerous. Her heart pounded as she approached the towering building, her senses overwhelmed by the sounds of slot machines and the chatter of tourists. But she wasn't distracted. Her focus was razor-sharp, her mind replaying every message, every lie, every stolen dollar. Victor Lane was inside, and tonight, Maggie intended to face him. Inside the casino, the air was thick with smoke and the clinking of chips. Maggie moved carefully, her eyes scanning the crowded room. It didn't take long to spot him. There he was, sitting at a high-stakes poker table, surrounded by a small group of people laughing at his every word. Victor looked completely at ease, his sunglasses perched on his nose, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. He leaned back in his chair, his confidence radiating. To anyone else, he was just another man enjoying a night out. But to Maggie, he was the man who had stolen her future. She stayed at a distance, watching him for several minutes. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the folded photo in her hand, the photo that had brought her here, the one Dion had uncovered during his investigation. It was surreal to see Victor in the flesh after months of chasing shadows. Maggie felt a surge of anger as she watched him laugh, completely unaware of the destruction he had left in his wake. She thought about the hours she had spent agonizing over her loss, the humiliation, the sleepless nights, the emptiness in her bank account. And here he was, living in luxury, surrounded by the rewards of his deceit. As Victor finished his hand and stood up, Maggie followed him at a distance. He strolled casually toward the casino's exit, his posture relaxed, his gait unhurried. He didn't have a care in the world. Outside, the air was cooler, the hum of the city providing a stark contrast to the tension building inside Maggie. She quickened her pace, her breath catching in her throat as she finally closed the distance between them. "Victor," she called out, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. He stopped and turned, his sunglasses reflecting the neon lights of the strip. For a moment, he seemed confused, his brow furrowing as he tried to place her. Then recognition flickered across his face, quickly replaced by a practiced smile. "Maggie," he said smoothly, spreading his arms in mock surprise. "What a pleasure to see you. I wasn't expecting this." Maggie's jaw tightened. The sight of his smug expression made her blood boil. "You weren't expecting me because you didn't think I'd find you," she replied, her voice colder now. Victor chuckled, as if her words were a joke he'd heard before. "Come on, Maggie. Let's not do this here. I can explain everything. You think there's an explanation for stealing $120,000 from me?" Maggie shot back, her voice rising. Victor took a step closer, lowering his sunglasses to look her in the eye. "I didn't steal anything, Maggie. You helped me out, and I appreciate that more than you know. But things got complicated. I'll make it right. I swear." Maggie's grip tightened on her purse. "Don't you dare patronize me. You lied to me. You made me believe in you, in us, and then you disappeared like a coward." Victor sighed, shaking his head as though he were the victim in this scenario. "Look, I've been through a lot lately. Business has been rough, but I'll fix this. You'll get your money back. You have my word." He started to turn away, dismissing her as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. But Maggie wasn't done. "Don't walk away from me," she shouted, her voice trembling with rage. Victor stopped, turning back to her with an exasperated look. "Maggie, let's be adults about this. You're upset, I get it, but this isn't going to solve anything." Maggie's chest heaved as she stared at the man who had taken everything from her. She reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against the cold, metallic object inside. She had brought it for protection, but now it felt like the only way to reclaim what he had stolen, not just her money, but her dignity. "You don't get to walk away from this," she said, her voice low but filled with resolve. Victor smirked, shrugging as if to say, "What are you going to do about it?" And then, in one swift motion, Maggie pulled the gun from her purse. The parking lot seemed to fall silent, the distant hum of the city fading into the background. Victor froze, his cocky demeanor evaporating as he raised his hands in mock surrender. "Whoa, Maggie," he said, his voice shaking now. "Let's not do anything drastic. We can talk about this." "You had plenty of chances to talk," Maggie replied, her hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Victor took a step back, his confidence unraveling with each passing second. "Come on, Maggie. You're not this person. You're not going to throw your life away over this." But Maggie wasn't listening. Months of pain, anger, and humiliation had boiled over, leaving no room for reason. And then it happened. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the parking lot, sharp and final. Victor staggered, his hands clutching his chest as he fell to the ground. The smugness that had defined him was gone, replaced by a look of shock and disbelief. For a moment, Maggie stood frozen, the gun still in her trembling hands. The reality of what she had done began to sink in, but there was no going back. She had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. As the sound of sirens approached in the distance, Maggie dropped the weapon and raised her hands. Her fate was sealed, but so was Victor's. In that moment, she felt an odd sense of closure. He had taken everything from her, but she had ensured he could never do it to anyone else again. In the courtroom, Maggie sat quietly, her face calm but haunted. She listened as the prosecution painted her as a vigilante, and as the defense portrayed her as a broken woman, driven by desperation. She didn't plead for sympathy, nor did she try to justify her actions. When she spoke, her words were simple: "I just wanted it to stop." The jury's verdict was clear: guilty of second-degree murder. Maggie Stanton was sentenced to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole. Outside the courtroom, debates raged on. Was Maggie a victim pushed to the brink, or a criminal who crossed a line? Her story became a symbol of desperation and the devastating consequences of betrayal. Romance scams like Victor Lane's don't just steal money, they shatter trust, dignity, and lives. For some, the emotional scars run deeper than the financial loss, leaving victims questioning everything they believed about themselves and others. So now, the question falls to you. If someone took everything from you, how far would you go to take it back? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Maggie's actions were justified, or did she go too far? We'd love to hear what you think.